This video is brought to you by Private Internet Access. More about them later in this video. Welcome back to Geographics. I'm your host, Cosmic Horror Madman Eric Malachite, and today we'll be talking about a hostage crisis event that is thought to be the precursor, which led to the modern prevailing attitude regarding terrorism and how to deal with terrorists. Yeah, that's right, we're talking about Entebbe, with a script penned by Ben Edelman. If Ben's provided socials, they'll be linked right alongside to my own channels and books. But with that said, let's get this started. In 1976, the eyes of the world were on the small African country of Uganda. It was there, at Entebbe, Uganda's main airport, that a hijacked French airliner with its cargo of terrorists and hostages had landed, seemingly far out of reach of any friendly rescue forces, and with the apparent blessing of Uganda's president, Idi Amin. The eyes of the world were also on the state of Israel, watching closely how their government would respond. After all, many of the plane's hostages were Israeli citizens, and the prisoners the hijackers were demanding the release of in exchange for their lives had participated in attacks against Israelis and their supporters all over the globe. It seemed as though Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin would have no choice but to give in, a humiliating defeat that many believe the fledgling state would be unable to withstand. Which is why what happened next was so surprising. The Israelis launched a daring rescue mission, the likes of which the world had never seen before, and which has never been successfully replicated. Operation Thunderbolt, in which Israeli special forces traveled over 3,000 kilometers from home, killed the hijackers and the Ugandan soldiers guarding them, and rescued over 100 hostages. It's considered to be the seminal moment in the creation of modern counterterrorism tactics. Military and police forces around the world applied the lessons of Entebbe in their own countries, beginning a marked shift towards resolving hostage crises by force. The phrase, "we do not negotiate with terrorists," has its origins with this dramatic story we're about to tell you.
We don't negotiate with terrorists.
The word hijacking had become alarmingly commonplace among the traveling public in the 1970s. Between 1968 and 1977, there were an average of 41 hijackings a year, many of them committed by radical groups such as the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, PFLP, who hoped to trade the lives of the hostages they took in exchange for political demands, such as the release of prisoners or the discontinuation of a particular government policy. Authorities responded to the spate of hijackings by tightening up security at airports, installing metal detectors and bag scanners to screen passengers in the hopes of preventing hijackers from being able to bring weapons on board in the first place. But there were many airports that hadn't kept up with the times and whose security protocols were considered lax, even dangerous. One of the worst offenders was in Athens, Alenkon International Airport, which is where Air France Flight 139 landed on June 27, 1976, on a stopover on its way from Tel Aviv to Paris. Some passengers disembarked the plane in Athens, and others got on board, including 3 men and a woman who had arrived that morning on a flight from Bahrain. None of the in-transit passengers had been checked by Greek security, who assumed they'd been screened at their initial departure airport, which is how all 4 of them were able to bring pistols and hand grenades onto Flight 139, concealed in their baggage. Soon after the plane took off from Athens, they hijacked the plane, brandishing guns and holding the grenades with the pins pulled. Classic terrorist move, right? 2 of the hijackers were Palestinians, members of the PFLP, which had been targeting Israel and countries supporting it since 1968. Despite orders from the Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO, to discontinue his attacks outside of Israel because of the negative press associated with it, PFLP leader Wadi Haddad continued his campaign by partnering with other left-wing organizations across the globe, including the West German Revolutionary Cells faction, which is where the other male hijacker, team leader Wilfried Bossa, and his female accomplice came from. If you're stuck in an airport terminal, hopefully not like the people who are the subject of today's video, you might be tempted to access the internet and pass the time watching Netflix. But stop! Wait! Watching Netflix without Private Internet Access VPN, the sponsor for today's video, is like traveling to London to visit Buckingham Palace, but you're stuck in the Oxford Circus tube station. Streaming services like Netflix and Amazon Prime restrict your access to shows and movies based on your geolocation. But with private internet access, you can access any region of Netflix in moments with zero headaches. For example, shows like The Office and It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia aren't available here in the US, and Brooklyn Nine-Nine only has the first 4 seasons available. Paya allows you to change your geolocation with a click of a button, and just like that, you're able to unlock so much content. So you can switch your location to the UK and The Office is suddenly available. But that's not all. Did you know that when you connect to Wi-Fi networks, your data is at risk of being exposed? Private internet access also hides your IP address and encrypts your internet connection. How does it work? Well, Paya transmits your data through a secured encrypted tunnel, giving you a high level of online anonymity and military-grade security. Private internet access is the world's most transparent VPN provider, with over 30 million downloads and 50 servers in the US. And best of all, their no-logs policy means they will never store your user data, something the company has proven multiple times in court. It's also available on every major operating system like Windows, macOS, Android, Linux, and iOS, and you can use one subscription on an unlimited number of devices. So you can protect your entire household with one subscription. Go to the link in the description to get 83% off private internet access. That's just $2.03 a month, and you also get 4 extra months for free. Signing up for private internet access is totally risk-free, and there's a 30-day money-back guarantee with 24/7 customer support. So what are you waiting for? Protect your entire household with one subscription. Mossad ordered the aircraft's crew to fly to Benghazi in Libya. That country's leader, Muammar Gaddafi, was a friend to the PFLP's cause, but it was not Flight 139's final destination. Instead, the Airbus A300 jet took off again, this time heading for a country few people on board knew anything about, the small East African country of Uganda. Uganda only has one international airport, located in the city of Entebbe, a short 40-kilometer drive southwest of the capital of Kampala. Situated on the northern shore of Lake Victoria, Africa's largest lake, Entebbe used to be the seat of power during the days when it was a British colony, which is why the airport opened there in 1929. It is also the home of State House, which is the official residence of Uganda's president, which in 1976 was the bombastic former soldier Idi Amin. Amin, who took power in 1971 following a military coup, cut a rather cartoonish figure to the rest of the world, swaggering around in a uniform festooned with medals and titles he'd largely awarded to himself. But within Uganda, he was deadly serious, known for ordering murders on a whim, particularly when he lost his temper. He ruled Uganda as one of the modern world's most brutal dictators. As many as 500,000 people are believed to have been murdered during his reign. Initially, Amin had been an ally of the Western world in Israel, but after Israeli PM Golda Meir refused to sell him F-4 fighter jets he planned to use on his neighbors, Amin turned instead to Libya and the Soviet Union, which gave him MiGs and other weapons. Few diplomats believe that Amin wasn't involved in the hijacking scheme up to his neck, as he claimed. PFLP leader Wadi Haddad had been spotted in the country during the crisis. 3 more armed hijackers had been permitted to join the original 4, and Ugandan army soldiers were all over the airport, effectively preventing the hostages from escaping the hijackers. The hijackers issued their demands on day 3 of the crisis. In return for the hostages, they wanted the release of 53 prisoners being held in 5 countries. If the prisoners weren't flown to Entebbe within 48 hours, they would start killing hostages. Israel's Prime Minister, Yitzhak Rabin's initial position followed that of international law. The plane was French. Therefore, the French government was responsible for the passengers. However, it soon became clear that Israel was going to be deeply involved in the process. After all, 40 of the prisoners on the terrorist list to be released were being held by the Israelis. Things got even more uncomfortable when word got out that the hijackers had separated the Israelis from the rest of the hostages and placed them in a separate room. Memories of the Holocaust 3 decades earlier came to mind, and it certainly didn't help that 2 of the terrorists were German. Minutes of cabinet meetings during the crisis showcased vigorous disagreement between Rabin and his defense minister, Shimon Peres. Peres argued that giving in to the hostage-takers' demands would represent a humiliation in the eyes of the world, one that the 28-year-old nation would be hard-pressed to recover from. It would also open the door to further extortion attempts that would put Israeli lives in danger. Rabin agreed with what Peres was saying. It wasn't as though he wanted to negotiate with the terrorists, but as Israel's leader, it would have been impossible for him to justify allowing hostages to be murdered simply to stand on principle. Unless the defense minister, who was responsible for the country's military, could provide him with a military option that stood a reasonable chance of success, his hands were tied. He would have to give in to their demands. Perez was adamant that a military operation to rescue the hostages was possible, but his ministry had no contingency plans in place. No one had ever thought up a scenario like this before. Two problems presented themselves: the tight July 1st deadline, and the fact that Entebbe was more than 3,000 kilometers from Israel territory. Just as it seemed Rabin was going to be forced to give in, the Israelis received two unexpected gifts. The hijackers agreed to extend the deadline until July 4th, and also to release more than half of their hostages, which were flown to France and reunited with their families. That left 103 hostages still in Entebbe, over 80% of which were Israelis, as well as the Air France flight crew and a few others. The man most likely responsible for the deadline extension was Amin, who needed to make a diplomatic trip to Mauritius, and wanted to be back in the country in time to gloat over his victory. The release of almost all the non-Israeli hostages put even more pressure on Rabin to act, while the deadline extension gave Perez's military planners time to come up with the military solution that everyone preferred to releasing prisoners that had committed terrorist acts against Israelis and other people all over the world. The plan they eventually put forward was codenamed Operation Thunderbolt, and it was as audacious as it was risky. The plan called for 4 C-130 Hercules aircraft loaded with a cargo of soldiers, weapons, and vehicles to Entebbe, where the soldiers would emerge, take out the hijackers and the Ugandan soldiers protecting them, rescue the hostages, and fly back again. The spearhead of the assault would be the best soldiers the Israeli Defense Forces, or IDF, had to offer, the Sayeret Matkal, colloquially known as the Unit, commanded by 30-year-old Yonatah Yoni Netanyahu. Perez convinced Rabin that Thunderbolt would work, and the PM ensured the plan was approved by the cabinet. Still, Rabin had his doubts. He ordered his secretary to prepare a letter of resignation from his post just in case the operation ended in failure. On July 3rd, the fleet of aircraft carrying the strike team took off from Sharm el-Sheikh in the Sinai Desert, which was Egyptian territory that had been captured by Israel during the Six-Day War in 1967. It was also the closest friendly territory to Entebbe. The planes flew along the Red Sea, a mere 100 feet above the waves, to avoid detection by Saudi Arabian and Egyptian radar. Surprise was the key to the operation. If even one of the slow-moving C-130s were shot down, the whole thing would be a disaster. The Israelis knew that the hostages were being kept in Entebbe's original terminal building, which had stood empty since the new terminal building had been opened in 1973. Thanks to intelligence gathered from the freed hostages, they knew that 7 terrorists and around 100 Ugandan soldiers would be on site to oppose them. There were also 11 MiG fighter jets, the pride of the Ugandan Air Force, parked at the airport, and a military garrison within the town of Entebbe itself. The plan was to deceive the Ugandans into believing that one of their own high-ranking officers was coming to visit the terminal. The Israelis were dressed in Ugandan army fatigues, and the lead car of their formation was a black Mercedes limousine with a Ugandan flag on the hood, just like the vehicle's generals rode around in. The key was to get to the terminal building and eliminate the hijackers before they had a chance to turn their guns on the hostages. Every person on the team remembered what had happened at Munich 4 years earlier, when terrorists took 11 members of the Israeli Olympic team hostage. A botched rescue attempt by German police resulted in the deaths of all of the athletes, as well as 5 terrorists and 1 German police officer. The first plane landed on Entebbe's runway without incident. No one knew they were coming. Out came the Mercedes and 2 Land Rovers loaded with troops from the unit, racing towards the old terminal building. However, one of the Ugandan sentries appeared not to buy their ruse, so Netanyahu shot him with a silenced pistol. However, he failed to kill the man, who got up and started shooting, 50 meters before they'd arrived at the building. Surprise had been lost, and the battle was on. Netanyahu's men raced toward the building, where the terrorists were already preparing for them. Right before the IDF made entry to the building, Wilfried Bosse turned his machine gun in the direction of the hostages, as if he was planning to fire on them. After all, he was the one that had threatened to kill them rather than to allow them to be rescued. But for whatever reason, perhaps compassion for those he'd kept prisoner for a week, he didn't. Instead, he turned toward the door and shot instead at the incoming Israeli troops. By the time the exchange of gunfire was over, all the terrorists had been killed. So had 3 hostages: Jean Jacques Mimouni, Ida Barakovich, and Pasco Cohen, all accidentally shot by the IDF during the exchange of gunfire. Outside, other IDF troops were engaging the Ugandan soldiers, who were just now realizing they were under attack. One of them, firing from the control tower, shot Yanni Netanyahu in the chest. Doctors on the scene did everything they could, but in a few minutes, he was dead. 5 other soldiers were wounded, including one who became a paraplegic after his spinal cord was severed. Between 20 and 45 Ugandans were killed in the fighting, as well as an unknown number of wounded. Once the gunfire died down, the hostages were loaded aboard Hercules 4, which was the first to take off from Entebbe. It was soon followed by the other 3 planes after the troops had finished mopping up on the ground. The entire operation was completed in less than 2 hours. One of the problems with the operation was how to get the planes back to Israel after the operation was over. They couldn't carry enough fuel for both legs of the trip. The solution was provided in the form of a secret agreement made with leading figures in the Kenyan government to allow the Israeli planes to refuel at Nairobi before leaving for Israel. In exchange, the IDF destroyed Idi Amin's prized fleet of MiGs on the ground at Entebbe, preventing him from using them in a retaliatory strike. Idi Amin initially thought his troops were rebelling against him when he heard the gunfire. So did most of his top military figures, who all hid. By the time anyone in the Ugandan chain of command realized what was happening, the Israelis had absconded with the hostages. His rage was so great that in the days after the operation, he ordered the executions of hundreds of people, including airport staff, surviving soldiers, and as many ethnic Kenyans living in Uganda as he could get his hands on, prompting a mass exodus across the border. When he discovered that one of the hostages, 72-year-old Dora Block, had been left behind in a hospital in Kampala, he vented his anger on her too. 4 members of his secret police, the State Research Center, abducted her from the hospital and killed her, making her the 5th Israeli victim of Operation Thunderbolt. Israel, meanwhile, was jubilant when it woke up to the news that the hostages had been rescued. The hostages were given a hero's welcome when they landed in Israel, and the fallen Yanni Netanyahu was transformed overnight into a martyr. His younger brother, Benjamin Netanyahu, himself a member of Sayeret Matkal at one time, used the fame provided by his connection to a war hero as a springboard into politics. As of this writing, he is the current Prime Minister of Israel. Whether a country approved or disapproved of the Entebbe raid largely depended on regional and Cold War lines. Arab and Soviet bloc states condemned it, while Israel's Western allies supported it. France decorated the flight crew with awards, including the Legion of Honor for the captain. Many in the United States were particularly supportive, considering the raid a proper way to celebrate their nation's bicentennial. Operation Thunderbolt, renamed Operation Yonatan afterwards in memory of its fallen commander, was the beginning of the end for Idi Amin. The cloak of invincibility he'd surrounded himself with had been smashed by the IDF, and he began to face more and more internal dissent from Ugandans unhappy with his rule. Uganda also increasingly found itself a pariah state because of Amin's viciousness and instability. It all came to a head in 1979 when a war he provoked with Tanzania backfired on him. The Tanzanians invaded Uganda along with rebel factions opposed to him. They quickly captured the capital and forced the dictator into exile. He died in Saudi Arabia in 2003. He left behind a country that continues to be troubled by internal corruption and external conflict with neighboring states. The current president, Yoweri Museveni, has run the country since 1986, repealing constitutional term limits and age restrictions to do so, winning elections that many believed are rigged. Entebbe Airport, meanwhile, remains Uganda's major international gateway, though most of the old terminal where the shootout took place has been demolished. Yitzhak Rabin would leave the Prime Minister's office in 1977, spending much of the 1980s as Israel's defense minister before being re-elected to the top job in 1992. He would win the Nobel Peace Prize in 1994, along with Shimon Peres and PLO leader Yasser Arafat, for his work signing the Oslo Peace Accords, before being assassinated in 1995 by a right-wing Israeli extremist, provoking shock and outrage around the world. Shimon Peres, meanwhile, had 2 stints as Israeli PM himself, including following Rabin's death, also serving as the president of the country from 2007 through 2014. He died in 2016 at the age of 93. As a result of Entebbe, Wadi Haddad was expelled from the PFLP. Any plans he had to continue the struggle on his own ended in 1978 when he died unexpectedly at the age of 50. Much speculation has been made about his death, with many believing that Israeli spies poisoned him. The PFLP stopped hijacking planes as well as conducting large operations outside of Israeli territory in the aftermath of Entebbe, though they remain one of Israel's most implacable foes to this day. The Entebbe operation is considered by many to be the father of modern counterterrorism tactics. Many countries, including the United States, France, West Germany, and the United Kingdom, created their own special forces teams modeled after the Israelis, specializing in counterterrorism. Domestic police departments have followed suit, responding to hostage situations of all kinds, with specialized officers equipped with heavy weapons and special tactics. Armed with these tools, governments have taken an increasingly hard line on terrorist organizations, coining the phrase, "We do not negotiate with terrorists." That remains official policy in many countries, including the United States. Operation Thunderbolt / Yonatan remains to this day one of the most audacious and successful hostage rescue missions ever undertaken. Considering the sheer distance involved, the short timetable, and the number of potential factors that needed to be considered, nothing else approaches it. The fact that it was an ad hoc operation conducted with the eyes of the world's media upon them makes it even more impressive. It took a combination of courage, daring, intelligence, and a good deal of luck to pull it off. But they did, which is why even 5 decades later, Israelis celebrate Entebbe as one of their country's greatest victories. Well, I certainly hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, be sure to do all that algorithmic jazz and keep it tuned here to Geographics for more videos like this. Go to the link in the description to get 83% off private internet access. That's just $2.03 a month, and you also get 4 extra months for free. Signing up for private internet access is totally risk-free, and there's a 30-day money-back guarantee with 24/7 customer support. So what are you waiting for? Protect your entire household with one subscription. I'm Eric Malachite, and I'll see you next time, Space Cowboy.